A black woman driving through a rich white neighborhood. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he spat, venom in every word. Samantha sat, trapped in her car, staring down the barrel of a gun and a face twisted by hate. He didn't see a person, he saw a target to unload his racist poison on. Her skin was his excuse, his rage a sickness. But her response, so sharp, it stopped him cold, not out of fear, but because he realized he just picked a fight with a woman carrying a power he couldn't handle. What state do you live in? Does your state still let hate walk free? Samantha Johnson lowered the car window, letting the early morning breeze sweep in. She sat in a sleek black SUV, interior lights off, radio silent, one hand resting gently on the steering wheel. The smartwatch on her wrist blinked a red light. An encrypted call from her tactical unit was pending. She was waiting for the exact moment to answer. Across the street stood a row of identical white fences, neatly trimmed lawns. Not a single fallen leaf in sight. A quiet neighborhood. The kind of quiet that makes a black driver feel like they're already doing something wrong just by being there. A patrol car cruised by, then slowed. In her rearview mirror, red and blue lights traced a brief arc and settled behind her. No trouble, she told herself, subconsciously adjusting her seatbelt. Headlights clicked on. The patrol car door opened, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered white man. Radio strapped to his shoulder, badge on his chest, Lieutenant B. Halverson. She glanced to her right. The phone lay on the passenger seat. Her left hand stayed on the wheel. "Ma'am, lower the window all the way. What are you doing here?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was clearly a command, no greeting. Samantha lowered the window another inch, her gaze calm. "I'm waiting for an official call. This is a public street." Brett stepped closer, right hand hovering near his holster. "I said, what are you doing in this neighborhood?" A chill crept up her back, not from the words, but from the posture. It wasn't suspicion, it was certainty. He had already decided she was the problem. "Again, I'm waiting on a call. My car is legally parked. Let me see your ID. You don't have a lawful reason for a stop." At that moment, Brett's eyes changed, as if he'd just made a decision. He drew his Glock straight from the holster and aimed it through the window. "I said, show me your ID, now!" No warning, no "I suspect you of," no "you violated," just a gun, pointed at a black woman in her own vehicle. Samantha didn't scream. She didn't resist. She simply opened her left palm slowly and raised it. Her right hand stayed still, her voice low, even, steady. "I'm unarmed. I'm not moving my hands." "Get your dukes out of the glove box," Brett shouted, louder this time. The gun stayed aimed at her head. A balcony door creaked open above. Someone was recording. Samantha saw it, and she knew. This moment wouldn't just live in her memory. It would exist online, be debated, distorted, defended, hated, but it would exist. She turned her head slightly, not too fast, not too slow, and looked at Brett. "Lieutenant Halverson." He froze for half a second. "What did you just call me?" "You heard me." She opened the center console and pressed a hidden button. A narrow slot slid open. Not a gun, not a phone, just a dark blue government ID wallet, stamped with a silver emblem. The air turned colder. Brett said nothing. His eyes widened. The gun still pointed, but his hand began to tremble. In that instant, no one yelled, no one moved. What shifted wasn't power, it was shame, naked and unhideable. Samantha held his gaze. "I suggest you lower your weapon. Not because I'm the director, but because you're in breach of police protocol." Brett lowered the gun. Stiffly, like every joint in his body resisted, she opened the car door and stepped out, still not touching anything else. "I will be documenting this incident in full. You may submit a written statement." Another SUV pulled up at the end of the street. A young brown-skinned man in plain clothes stepped out. His eyes met Brett's. Not hostile, but something in the look made Brett turn away. Samantha nodded to the man, then turned back. Not with fury, not with challenge. Just the silence of someone who has lived a lifetime under the barrel of a gun and today had chosen not to bow. The car pulled away. Behind it, Brett stood alone, his face no longer that of an officer in command, but of a man who had just realized he wasn't the one in control. No yelling, no erratic reaction, no screaming, "I'm with the FBI." Samantha simply opened a small slot from the dashboard and quietly placed her badge against the windshield. It wasn't big, and it didn't shine, but in the flickering red blue lights, every word on it carried the weight of a verdict. Federal Bureau of Investigation Director, Samantha L. Johnson. Brett froze. He might not have read the full name, but the first two words were enough to drain the blood from his face. His hand still held a gun, but the knuckles turned white. His eyes went from the badge to her, the black woman he'd considered a threat just moments ago. Not because she had a weapon, not because she behaved suspiciously, just because she was in a place he instinctively assumed was not hers. There was no background music at that moment, no sirens, just the sound of a man breathing, as he realized that the power logic he'd internalized in his years as a cop had just been shattered by a single line of text. Tamitha didn't smile. She didn't act triumphant. Her eyes didn't hold the look of someone eager to bring another person down. It was the look of someone who had been doubted, questioned, and judged far too many times, and who now, finally, had the chance to make someone stop and take a hard look at themselves. She opened the car door, not too fast, not too slow, stepped out, stood tall, didn't reach for her phone, didn't make any move that could be misinterpreted, just one action. She met his gaze with a silent declaration. "This time, you picked the wrong person." Brett stepped half a pace back. The gun in his hand drooped, not because he'd decided to lower it, but because his arm had started to tremble. His mind raced with questions. What if she really is the director? Who's going to find out? Where are the cameras? How will the department react? Is someone recording this? But there was one question he didn't dare ask himself. What if she were just a regular person? What would I have done next? Samantha remained still. No retreat, no aggression. She didn't have to say anything. Her name on that badge said it all. And that silence, that was what terrified Brett more than any insult or reprimand ever could. That silence was something men like him were never trained to face. In the force, they're taught to handle people who yell back, who run, who scream, but they're not taught what to do when someone stands their ground with absolute legitimacy and no fear. Somewhere in Brett's chest, a tightness rose. Not guilt, not regret, but the realization that for the first time, he was not at the top of the power structure he thought he owned. Behind them, a light flicked on from a second-floor window. A phone was raised. Someone was filming. Brett glanced quickly, then looked back at Samantha, the woman he now just wanted to get away from, though no one had ordered him to. But Samantha didn't leave. She stood there for a few more seconds, as if giving Brett time to absorb the moment. Not out of vengeance, but to offer him a chance to understand. Not everyone bows their head. Across the street, a second-floor window opened slightly. A middle-aged white woman stood behind the railing, phone in hand. She didn't yell, she didn't call the police, she barely dared to breathe. When the officer drew his gun, instinct made her hit record without even thinking. At first, it was curiosity. Rarely did anything interesting happen in this quiet neighborhood. But when the barrel pointed directly at the windshield, curiosity turned to dread. And then, when she saw the badge, her fear became pure shock. She zoomed in slightly to read the text. Her hand trembled, but stayed steady enough to keep the frame. Wind blew her hair across her face. The image wavered slightly, but didn't lose focus. The patrol car's lights reflected clearly off the badge. Federal Bureau of Investigation Director. She tapped to turn on voice recording too, because she knew that images could be edited, but sound doesn't lie. Below, Brett began to step back, not by procedure, but like a man trying to retreat from his own actions. The gun lowered not from command, but because even he feared that a reflex could cause everything to explode. Truthfully, it already had, The moment he saw that badge, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Windows lit up one by one. People stood behind curtains. No one stepped out. No one said a word. No one called 911. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't an accident. No one could say exactly what they were witnessing, but everyone felt it clearly. If this could happen to an FBI director, none of them were truly safe. They stayed silent, not out of apathy, but because in that moment they saw themselves in the mirror of fear, a fear that the system could turn a gun on anyone, at any time. The woman across the street kept recording. She had no plan. She wasn't a journalist, not an activist, but that clip, just hours later, would show up on an anonymous TikTok account. No filters, no flashy captions, just one line in stark black and white. White cop points gun at black woman, then sees her badge and panics. The video lasted less than 47 seconds. No background music, just the sound of sharp breathing, flashing lights, and the moment a gun slowly dropped, dragged down by the weight of truth. Within 10 hours, the video was shared over 2 million times. The hashtags FBI while black, FBA did not save me, and trended worldwide. Evening news programs aired Samantha Johnson's image, though many outlets avoided stating her title, Director of the FBI, as if it were too unbelievable to verify. But the truth remained. In Samantha's eyes, in Brett's silence, and in that video that could never be undone. Back in that moment, there were no sirens, no cheers, no applause, no scene of order restored, just the flickering light of a patrol car, a man standing on the wrong side of truth, and a woman who hadn't blinked, perhaps because she knew something had just shifted, not just for her, but for everyone silently watching behind their curtains. Brett stood frozen. He hadn't been arrested, hadn't been reprimanded. No one had given any order. But in that moment, he knew. The power he believed was absolute had never truly belonged to him. No one in the neighborhood knew that when Samantha was asked to roll down the window, her hand had lightly brushed the face of her watch, a touch that seemed accidental, but it activated Echelon Black Mode, an internal alert signal reserved exclusively for senior personnel under unidentified threat. No sound, no light, just a stream of data transmitted in silence, bypassing public encryption, hopping across relay servers, and landing in a device with bilateral encryption, the wristwatch of an escort agent within a 1.5-mile radius. The recipient didn't need to ask what had happened, because the rule was simple. If an alert is triggered, the situation is serious enough that a high-level decision must be made within 90 seconds. The system doesn't question. It has only one function: to activate the human. In this case, the recipient wasn't a SWAT team, nor a bodyguard. It was her son, Elijah Johnson, a young agent in training under the Federal Senior Personnel Protection Program. He had no official badge yet, had never led a unit, but he had top-tier clearance for one purpose only: to protect Samantha Johnson in unpredictable scenarios. Elijah didn't drive a sleek black SUV, didn't wear a visible gun, didn't wear a jacket with an emblem. He was dressed in plain clothes, holding a foam cup of coffee, playing the role of a local out for a quiet morning stroll. But his eyes never left the patrol car, and his other hand had been at his waist ever since the signal flashed. Beneath his jacket was a compact Sig Sauer P365, already unlocked. Elijah knew his mother's action was an early warning, but also a sign that things could go very wrong, very fast. He had never imagined that the first situation requiring him to implement an intervention protocol would involve his own mother, the person who had trained him in battlefield control, being the one with a gun pointed at her in broad daylight, in a neighborhood that was supposed to be the safest. Elijah didn't act, not out of fear, but because he understood exactly what qualified as grounds for intervention, and when his presence would add value, not emotion. He saw his mother from 80 meters away, saw the red fluid flashes reflected off the glass, and saw the gun drawn without a warning protocol. And he also saw her still. He knew she wasn't armed. He knew she wasn't wearing armor. But he also knew, if she stood still, it meant she still had control of the situation. And perhaps the hardest thing for Elijah to process wasn't seeing her threatened. It was realizing how used she'd become to being doubted, to having a gun aimed at her face, that she could still remain absolutely calm. He didn't retreat, didn't approach. He adjusted his breathing, placed his finger near the level 2 alert button, and waited. Not for something to go wrong, he was waiting for his mother, like a young soldier awaiting a signal from his commander. Because he knew, even with a gun aimed at her, his mother had never been someone who lacked control. Elijah stood behind a low hedge, about 40 meters from her car, close enough to clearly see the officer's eyes, far enough to avoid being noticed. He subtly rotated his wrist and opened the tracking mode on his watch. A red dot marked the target's location, Samata, accompanied by a warning. Threat level undetermined. Response network not activated. Inside him, two conflicting commands collided. One, he was the assigned agent for direct oversight of the FBI director and must intervene immediately if a threat arose. Two, he was the son of the woman currently staring down a gun and could not afford to be wrong or react emotionally. In training scenarios, the target is always assumed to be a stranger, but there was never a lesson that prepared him for this, when the target was his mother, the largest figure in his life, the reason he joined the Bureau. Elijah saw her step out of the car, not fast, not panicked, not defensive, just stepped out, as if nothing was pointed at her head. She held out her badge, stared directly at the officer. No threats, no shouting, "I'm with the FBI," just her eyes and her posture. And that was what made the moment even more precarious. One wrong move from either side could push things past the point of no return. Elijah's hand tightened slightly, his palm slick with sweat. But he didn't move forward. He couldn't. If he intervened too early, the encounter would instantly be classified as an armed conflict. If he drew his gun, even by protocol, the story could be twisted into two black individuals assaulting a cop. And despite being the director's son, despite wearing the FBI name, one misfire would be enough to shut down the entire investigative network. He couldn't be wrong. He was not allowed to be wrong. Elijah stepped a few paces closer, just enough for Brett to see him. He said nothing, didn't touch his gun, didn't flash a badge, just stood there, silently, with intention. And in the moment Brett glanced over, he realized he wasn't just being watched. He was being watched by someone who knew exactly which procedures he was violating. That glance made Brett step back half a pace. No commands were given, but that quiet presence alone shifted the entire balance. And as Samata's eyes met her son's, she didn't smile, didn't thank him. She just gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Good, you're here, but I'm still in control." Elijah stood there, back straight, eyes wide open, unblinking, in the role of an observer, but also as a son, seeing, for the first time, his mother more composed than anything he had ever imagined. He didn't need to step in, because the person he was assigned to protect had never once needed someone else to step in for her. Less than 4 hours after the incident, a 47-second clip began circulating on TikTok. No effects, no subtitles or narration, just shaky footage, flashing red and blue lights, and the sharp command of a police officer, "Step out of the vehicle and show me your documents." The clip ends with the moment the officer freezes upon seeing the words on the card, "FBI Director Samata L. Johnson." The account that posted the clip was newly created, with no profile picture, no bio, only a username. @SilentWindow87. No one knew who was behind it, but the video spread fast, too fast. Within the first 30 minutes, it had been shared 14,000 times. In the next 2 hours, it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit. And then, it moved out of the realm of civil debate and into the gray zone of public opinion is split into two distinct camps. One side was outraged, calling it clear proof of systemic racism. They highlighted each frame, circling the drawn gun, posting with hashtags like FBI while black, power and prejudice, and the question, if she wasn't the FBI director, what would have happened? But the other side didn't stay silent. They pushed back with familiar rhetoric. Why didn't she comply with police orders? Sitting in a black car in a white neighborhood and refusing to cooperate? What do you expect? Don't confuse a title with innocence. If she had nothing to hide, why act defensive? In private groups, any post containing the phrase "black woman," FBI, gunpoint, instantly drew thousands of comments. Many assumed it was a media setup designed to undermine law enforcement. Others accused the person who filmed the clip of violating an officer's privacy. Then, less than a day later, the woman who recorded the video, the owner of @SilentWindow87, received a threat. No name, no return address, just a handwritten note. You post anything else? Don't be surprised when the cops knock on your door at midnight. She was terrified, had no idea what to do. She wasn't an activist, wasn't famous, just a retired language teacher. She recorded the video because something felt off, nothing more. But now, her private life was under attack. Her phone was hacked, her email was accessed strangely, and a strange car had been parked across from her home for 2 straight nights. She thought about deleting the account, but before she could, she got a message from an anonymous profile. It said only one thing: "We know you posted the clip, but we also know without you, no one would have believed it happened." It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a reminder that her choice was no longer a private one. Meanwhile, the media started picking up the story. But oddly, many major networks reported it with surprising restraint. They didn't name Samantha Johnson. They didn't mention the FBI. They referred to her as a woman asked to comply without clear justification, or an unidentified individual involved in a tense encounter. That vague language only gave more fuel to the doubters. See, no confirmation. What if the badge is fake? What if the clip was staged? However, an internal FBI source confirmed the woman in the video was Director Johnson, and she was on a personal mission related to her work, but the FBI made no public statement. That silence left a vacuum, and the vacuum was filled with speculation of every kind. On Twitter, a post from an independent journalist went viral. A white FBI director would never have a gun pointed at them in their own car, but a black woman does. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a map of power, who's assumed to have it and who isn't. The tweet racked up nearly 500,000 likes in under 6 hours. But it also triggered a wave of backlash under the hashtag #FollowCommandsFirst, where users insisted that cooperating with police is mandatory, no matter who you are. Amid the public uproar, Samantha remained silent. No posts, no press conference. She continued showing up to the office like normal, but what the public didn't see was this. The FBI's Internal Crisis Response Unit had started holding unusual meetings about protocols for managing media fallout. And as for the woman who filmed the clip, after long deliberation, she handed over the original, unedited footage to an independent human rights organization. She included just one line in her email: "I don't want to be a hero. I just don't want to stay silent like all the other times." 6 o'clock in the evening, the prime news hour. The broadcast opened with the weather, followed by traffic updates, then a short segment on a local festival. Everything moved along smoothly, neatly, without a ripple. And then, at exactly the 17th minute, the anchor's tone shifted ever so slightly as they introduced the segment labeled Urban Order News. A blurry image appeared on screen. No faces visible, no video footage. Just a distant photo of a police car parked on the roadside. This morning, a brief emergency occurred in a northeastern residential area. The anchor read flatly. According to reports, a police officer requested to inspect a vehicle that was pulled over in an unusual manner, leading to a minor misunderstanding between both parties. No one was injured, and the situation was quickly brought under control. The police department is currently reviewing its approach in cases involving sensitive communication. There was no mention of Samate, no image of the woman, no word about the official badge, not a single mention of the FBI or any position. The entire report was like a thin sheet draped over a deep wound, unable to hide the blood, but enough for others to ignore it. Across the ticker at the bottom of the screen, a line scrolled by quickly. Local police declined to provide further comment pending internal investigation, and then, right after that, the broadcast shifted to a light-hearted feature on students planting trees at school. That smoothness wasn't an accident. It was carefully edited so that no one had to be held responsible, no one was called to account, and no one dared speak up. The local community, those who had seen the clip circulating all day online, were stunned. Something like that, and it's mentioned in under a minute? Read a comment beneath the replay video on the news station's website. So what I saw in that clip was that fake? Online, people were cutting segments of the news and splicing them alongside the original footage to compare. On one side, screaming and drawn guns. On the other, a calm voice reading the news, as if reporting a minor traffic incident. The contrast couldn't have been starker or more infuriating. But the station didn't revise, didn't update, didn't issue a correction. They didn't follow up with any additional reports. As far as they were concerned, the story was over, and for many, that was exactly how the system silenced people, not through suppression, but by pretending you never existed. Samantha sat in her office, the light from the TV screen casting across her expressionless face. The news, replayed, the anchor's voice, flat and even, like reading minutes from a meeting. She said nothing. No frown, no scoff. She just sat there, still, as if every word on the screen had nothing to do with her, though each and every line was a public erasure of her existence. On her desk was a thick stack of files, none related to that morning's incident. No complaints, not media responses. These were internal investigations, suspended indefinitely, reports never approved, names that disappeared off the radar after the final line, insufficient evidence. Her left hand flipped through the pages while her right toyed with the wristwatch she'd worn since morning, the same watch that had sent the emergency signal at a life-or-death moment. She didn't need her name on air. She didn't demand justice on camera. For Samantha, the media wasn't where justice was reclaimed. It was just a thermometer for a slow-burning fever, a way to see who was heating up, who was staying cool, and who was pretending not to feel sick at all. Inside the FBI, her silence didn't bring peace. On the contrary, it made those higher up uneasy. An internal memo was sent to the operations division. Public concern is escalating. Recommend assessing brand risk if no response is made within 72 hours. Not a word about ethics, fairness, or truth. Only brand risk. No one cared about Samantha. They cared about what Samantha might become if she chose to speak. She read that report without surprise. In her 23 years working within the system, nothing shocked her anymore. The ones who once praised her as a symbol of reform now avoided saying her name in meetings. Colleagues who once sought her advice on media strategy now sent health check-ins through their assistants instead of calling her directly, like they used to. Samantha wasn't angry, she just remembered. She remembered every glance that turned away, every name that sidestepped, even the silence, which now revealed itself as the most sophisticated form of political response, was waiting to see which way the wind would blow. She was used to it. She was just waiting to see who in the system still remembered that prolonged silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity, dressed up as professionalism. And she had never been the kind of person to let others decide what she stood for, even when the world refused to say her name. That morning, before a gun was pointed at her face, Samantha was waiting for an important call. It wasn't on her schedule. It wasn't from any internal contact under her authority. It was from someone who once stood on the other side of the line, between what we call justice and whatever remains when that word loses its meaning. The person had the designation W-19, a former investigator from the district attorney's office who vanished from the system around 14 months ago after an unverifiable medical resignation. But Samantha knew better. For over a year and a half, they had communicated through a triple-layer encrypted relay routed through a server in Reykjavik. No U.S. metadata, No access logs, no internal IP trail. The protocol wasn't built for communication, it was built for surviving in silence. WN-19 never sent a photo, never used a real voice, but the content was real. The fragments he passed on, sometimes just a deleted email, a manipulated timestamp, a photoshopped signature, matched perfectly with what she was investigating. A system-wide pattern of falsified reports and the freezing of civil complaints inside local oversight. Then, 3 days before the incident, he sent her one final message. I have what you think no longer exists. Not copies, originals. Signed. They agreed to meet at a neutral location, an abandoned public library on the suburban edge, marked in the FBI's internal maps as a non-operational zone. But for absolute safety, W-19 requested one final confirmation call, scheduled for that exact morning, right when Samata pulled over. The call never came. Instead, there was a gun at her window, and W-19 disappeared. The relay node stopped responding. The encryption protocol shut down. The entire line was dead. No signal made it through the backup servers. Samata tried the emergency handshake, just a string of characters known only to the two of them. Nothing. Everything was programmed to self-existed after a set moment, as if the source had never existed, but she knew he had. She'd seen verified data, matched signatures, confirmed internal documents. The terrifying part wasn't that he vanished, it was that someone made sure the connection was severed before anything could surface. In Samata's world, people don't get erased for being curious. They disappear when they hold something the system cannot allow to exist, not even for a minute longer. That afternoon, Samata sat alone in the safe room. No cameras, no microphones, no outward connections. No official calendar entry. On the table was a computer built for secure communication analysis. No standard operating system, no internet updates. It opened only with dual biometric access, retina and pinky fingerprint. She reopened the dialogue log with W-19. Every conversation was short, just a few lines, but the logic was clear, consistent, and methodical, not chaos. The final message was tagged ER-12, an alert for county-level information sensitivity, meaning records that once existed officially but had since been delisted and recoded. A phrase had echoed across the last 3 weeks of his messages. Signing without reading is the greatest crime. It wasn't a threat. It was a confirmation. He wasn't accusing the system. He was identifying the exact individuals who had signed blindly, who had become its instruments. Samatha recalled the cases labeled internally resolved by the media. Complaints that vanished, responses suspended, case closures, all justified by insufficient grounds to proceed. But if those conclusions were based on falsified data, or never reviewed at all, then the entire structure was flawed from the start. The documents W-19 mentioned, if they truly existed, wouldn't just indict individuals, they would force the entire system to confront its own mechanisms. She didn't believe what happened that morning was part of a master plan, but it happened, deliberately or not, at the exact moment needed to sever her final link to a key source. You don't need to eliminate someone. Just prevent two people from connecting. That's enough. In the most protected systems of power, losing data is less dangerous than losing timing, and she had just lost timing. W-19 might be retired, detained somewhere, or forced underground under a new identity. But one thing was certain. Someone had known about the meeting, or at least sensed her investigation had reached a point too dangerous to ignore. Tamitha wasn't afraid. She had always planned for being outpaced. But this was a signal. The game was no longer about one cop breaking protocol. It was about a system shielding something old and far too dangerous to be unearthed. The moment all contact with W-19 was lost, Samita didn't wait for another signal. Someone like W-19 disappearing without warning at such a suspiciously timed moment meant someone already knew what she was getting close to. And if that was the case, then reviewing the internal system herself was the only step she could take without using channels likely to be monitored. She started with Brett Halverson. In the State Security Personnel Bureau's database, Brett's record appeared like an ideal showcase. Clean, trustworthy. No recorded breaches of protocol or serious complaints. But to Samantha, a perfectly clean file was sometimes the biggest red flag. She unlocked Tier 3 access, a subsystem only available to federal-level interagency auditors. Behind that level of clearance, 3 complaint records surfaced. 3 independent IDs from 3 different people at 3 separate times, but all shared the same tag, withdrawn at complainant's request. What caught Samantha's attention wasn't the reason, it was the timing. All 3 complaints had been withdrawn within 72 hours of submission, abnormally fast. The system recorded the withdrawal times, but included no details on why. When she pulled up the archived PDFs, she noticed all the withdrawal forms were virtually identical, from formatting to grammar as if copied from a pre-written template. The same name appeared as the verifying officer on all 3, Administrative Sergeant Mark D. Lewis, retired 5 years prior. His file noted that he had been in charge of internal review during transition periods, often the final sign-off before a complaint was marked case closed, no further investigation. Samantha didn't suspect the data had been altered. Quite the opposite, everything was too tidy, too by the book. It made her believe the system had learned how to process complications without hiding them, by simply converting them into voluntary withdrawals. No one had the authority to question a document bearing the complainant's signature, even if no one could confirm it was signed under fair conditions. The first 2 cases Samantha flagged for later review. But when she got to the 3rd file, she paused. A line of description stood out, a familiar name, and a consequence never recorded in any official report. Following the incident, the subject experienced level 3 anxiety disorder, dropped out of school. No further follow-up. This wasn't a case of withdrawing to avoid trouble. It was a forced exit for someone who had nowhere else to go. The boy's name was Mateo Rivera, 15 years old. A freshman at West Elm High, Latino family, legally immigrated, father deceased. Mother worked as a kitchen assistant at a local restaurant. No record, no gang ties. His school file was clean. Decent grades, good conduct, never disciplined. Samantha read through every line of the old report. The incident happened at 6:41 p.m. Early spring. Mateo was riding his bike home from tutoring when Brett Halverson stopped him near the old elementary school's parking lot, a spot flagged as a known drug activity zone. The reason for the stop, suspicious U-turn upon seeing law enforcement. Brett's statement claimed the boy attempted to flee and reached into his pockets. No weapons found, no drugs, yet he was subdued, forced to the ground on the pavement. A witness wrote in their account, "The officer drew his gun and pressed it to the boy's head, even though he had already sat down and was crying. Police didn't detain him overnight, just filed a report and let him go. But for that boy, what lingered was the barrel of a gun, and a humiliation that couldn't be erased." 4 days later, Mateo was found hanging in the school restroom. In his jacket pocket was a quarter-folded sheet of paper, written in pencil, "I'm not a bad kid, but I know if I stay alive, everyone will think I am." Mateo's mother, Lucia Rivera, was the one who filed the complaint, but it was withdrawn in under 48 hours. No lawyer, no counseling, no support from the school or parent association. Samantha searched for the withdrawal form, found only a blank template, sloppily signed with no personal notes, and, most oddly, the complaint was closed on the same day. A $2,500.00 transfer was made to her account from an anonymous source labeled as funeral expense support. No further investigation, no follow-up, no disciplinary file for Brett, and Mateo, though never charged, was never called anything other than subject exhibited excessive reaction during routine check. Samantha sat still for a long time after reading that line. She was no longer angry, no longer shocked, only felt something tighten in her chest, as if the shots that should never have been fired were still echoing in the minds of those who never got to live fully in the name they were given. Mateo had nothing left to withdraw. No form, no memory, no words to defend himself. All that remained were blank spaces in his file, and a system too used to calling death unfortunate, instead of what it truly was, being pushed past the edge. It took Samantha nearly a week to find Lucia Rivera's new address. Her name was no longer in the voter registry. Her health insurance had been cut off 2 years ago. School records related to Mateo were sealed and out of date. It was as if the boy's death had severed all trails, no signal left to follow. Eventually, a data point from a housing support network for single mothers led Samantha to a border zone neighborhood, outside urban planning maps, not clearly under the jurisdiction of any elected local council. Apartment 3B, an old building with damp gray walls and peeling paint on the door. No name outside, just a handwritten number taped crookedly beneath the doorbell with old Scotch tape. Samantha rang 3 times. No reply. On the 3rd ring, the door creaked open. Lucia Rivera stood there, thinner than the profile photo from 7 years ago, eyes deep set. Not evasive, but without hope either. She didn't ask, "Who is it?" didn't greet, didn't invite her in, and she didn't shut the door. She just looked at Samantha, as if she had foreseen this moment long ago. "If it had been you 10 years ago," she said, her voice not loud but heavy. "I would have gone to court. I would have spoken up. I would have done everything to force them to answer." Samantha stood still. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." Words like that held no weight here. The draft from the hallway carried in dampness, the scent of aging walls, and a cold that slipped down her collar like a reminder. This wasn't a visit. It was a reckoning. Lucia looked down at the floor, then up again, as if recalling every step of a story she didn't want to tell, but still owed someone an ending. They called me in," she continued. "No threats, no yelling, just handed me a paper. Said that if I didn't withdraw the complaint, the press would get involved. They'd ask if Mateo ever hung around with any kids who had records. They'd find that photo of him smiling next to the boy who'd been in juvie, and they'd run with it. They'd label my son as associated with a juvenile offender, and people would believe it, because my son wouldn't have the chance to answer for himself." Her voice didn't tremble, but her hand clenched a fistful of her shirt. A small gesture, enough for Samantha to see. Old pain doesn't fade. It just quiets down to last longer. Licia turned away. She didn't invite Samantha in, but didn't refuse either. The door remained open, as if what remained in her wasn't trust, but some strange sense of duty toward a stranger who had the patience to knock, in the rhythm of someone who hadn't knocked in a long time. The apartment was silent, almost forgotten, but clearly someone still lived there, not living with time, but passing each day as if counting breaths. Lucia pulled out a wooden chair, placed it in front of Samantha, then sat across from her. She didn't ask why Samantha was there, didn't ask who she was or what organization she represented. She simply poured a glass of water and slid it gently toward her guest. The gesture was calm, as if this wasn't her first time speaking to someone who claimed to stand for justice she no longer believed in. You know," she began, eyes fixed on a crack in the old wall, "I used to think killers were evil. That if I spoke better English, if I could afford a lawyer, if I talked to the press, things might have turned out differently. But now I understand. They didn't need to shoot." She paused, then looked straight at Samantha. No hatred, just a kind of pain that had run out of tears. "They just had to make you ashamed enough to step away from the fight. They didn't need to kill my son, just make him believe he'd be killed eventually. And they didn't need to beat me, just show me that whatever I said would be repeated by someone else with better credentials." Samantha's hands wrapped tightly around the glass, cold. Not from the water, but from the air in the room, a cold that came not from weather, but from memories buried deep, untouched, unwanted. Lucia leaned down, opened a drawer, pulled out an old object, wrapped in a handkerchief. She placed it on the table, slid it toward Samantha. His final assignment. The teacher said he wrote it after being detained by the police, but still came back to school for 2 more days. She didn't read it, said it was turned in late. Then he died. Samantha opened it. A page torn from a school notebook, neatly written in black ink. Justice should make the guilty afraid, not silence the innocent. No one said anything after that. Lucia stood. She didn't see her guest out, but she didn't send her away either. She walked back inside, leaving behind one short sentence, both an explanation and a declaration that the meeting was over. I don't need to believe anymore, but if you still have the guts to believe in something that tried to kill you, then don't let it kill anyone else. The door closed, no sound of a lock, no goodbye. Samantha rose to her feet, in her hands a boy's final essay, and the eyes of a mother who no longer waited for justice, but still left the door open for someone brave enough to knock on the truth. Every lead surrounding Brett Halverson had gone cold, as if they had never existed. People involved had been reassigned, retired, or couldn't recall the details. Surveillance cameras in the area of the incidents had no archived footage. Temporarily registered accounts were deleted or absorbed into anonymized audit bundles. Samantha wasn't surprised. This is how the system covers itself, not by wiping things clean, but by making them indistinct. What she needed wasn't in a data file. It was in the hand that once signed off on it. Reviewing internal personnel assignments from the time Brett was transferred from patrol to rapid response, a familiar name surfaced like a bell striking memory. Douglas K. Phelps, former chief supervisor of federal internal investigations, the man who had personally signed Samantha's suspension order a decade earlier. She remembered that case as if carved in stone. A vague internal inquiry about suspected leaks to the press. No evidence. No cross-verification. Just a memo stating Samantha had refused to cooperate by withholding private communications with journalistic sources. Back then, her reputation was still raw. She held no position powerful enough to earn protection, and Phelps, with a tone as rigid as a military order, had given her a choice. 3 months unpaid leave, step away from all active cases, and speak nothing of the inquiry. She accepted. Not out of submission, but because she had nothing in her hands to fight back. But Phelps remembered her, and now his name appeared again as Brett's direct supervisor during the exact period when 3 complaints were withdrawn at the request of the complainant. The reassignment file stated plainly, transfer approved, response capability validated, exempt from complaint retrieval for this review cycle. A single line, but enough to understand. Brett had been moved quietly, with no questions allowed. Phelps was no longer at the FBI. He now served as Regional Coordination Director for a federal security office, an agency tasked with overseeing conduct potentially harmful to the image of law enforcement. In other words, an office built to shut down anything that threatened public reaction. Samantha zoomed in on Phelps's signature from Brett's personnel file. Right heating slant, the K always pressed, ending with a sharp dash, like a stroke, meant to shut down any dialogue. She'd seen that handwriting 10 years ago, on a sealed notice atop her desk, the one that marked a forced detour in her career. But this time, she didn't just have experience. She had data. She had a network of silenced stories, mothers who had lost their children, a system working to turn silence into a moral code. Samantha looked at Phelps's signature, then shut her laptop. If he had forgotten her, then the past would remind him. 3 days later, at the Roosevelt Hotel Conference Center, 17th floor, the Regional Federal Security Symposium was in session. The theme was printed large on every banner: restoring trust, integrity and accountability in law enforcement. Listed beneath the title were the speakers: representatives from the Department of Homeland Security, an FBI Inspector General, and at the very end, one quiet final name: Douglas K. Phelps, Director of Eastern Regional Security Coordination. Samantha didn't register to speak. She entered the hall like any other attendee, observer badge on her chest, long coat, unremarkable. But inside, she knew every eye was trained on the stage, where an older man with silver hair, tall build, voice still steel hard, held a microphone and spoke with words polished like chrome. Public trust doesn't just come from action, it comes from tight internal control and the ability to self-correct before accountability is imposed. The room nodded. A few took notes. Phelps didn't see Samantha, but every word he spoke echoed in her ears like a silent slap. 10 years ago, that very man had used the phrase self-correct to push her out for 3 months over an investigation with no proof, only because she refused to expose a confidential source. She opened her phone, drafted a short email, just 7 lines, addressed directly to the Office of Federal Ethics Oversight. E. Samuel L. Johnson, Acting Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, formally request the reopening of suspension case file 20XX, code IRF 19762, previously processed under the supervision of Douglas K. Phelps, now serving at VDAE. I request a public confrontation and submit data strings related to the 3 complaints withdrawn during the same period. She hit send. Seconds later, the screen displayed. Email routed to secure distribution system, awaiting recipient digital signature verification. Phelps was still speaking. He emphasized, "No organization can endure if its members fail to put collective duty above personal emotion." Applause. A smile from one of the organizers. Everything flawless except one thing. He didn't know that a sealed data trail he once marked closed had just been unearthed by the person he thought had gone silent forever. Samantha stood up, not in a rush, no confrontation needed, but her footsteps echoed through the hall, just enough for a backstage aide to glance her way. Tonight her name would surface in internal emails, and Phelps, if he had any instincts left, would realize the one person he didn't want to see in that room had entered it, and had just forced the system to resubmit its justification, this time to itself. The winter of 2013 was unusually bitter, with snow blanketing the streets around the Millstone Police Department, a small city but one that had been under special monitoring by the Department of Justice, due to a sharp rise in racial discrimination complaints for 3 consecutive years. When Samantha was assigned there, she didn't think this would become a career-defining mission. It was supposed to be a 3-month post as a regional deputy supervisor, tasked with advising on misconduct investigation protocols and supporting precincts undergoing internal ethics reassessment. At the time, Millstone PD was scrambling to reform. The media had begun spotlighting violent arrests of undocumented immigrants, particularly from Central American communities. The department's leadership tried to project a new image by bringing in a fresh batch of trainees, young, better trained, straight from the State Police Academy. But what Samantha saw, even in her first week, were new faces with old mindsets, just wrapped in cleaner uniforms. One of them was Brett Halverson, blond, tall, with cold, sharp eyes, always leading the rapid response drills. His academy evaluations were stellar, with notes like proactive, decisive, well-suited for high-pressure scenarios. A description that sounded positive unless you witnessed the way he shouted at a Honduran teen during an ID check simulation. "How the hell did you get here? What camp did you escape from?" All because the boy didn't understand the command and was slow to produce his documents. Samantha didn't wait for supervisors to intervene. She called Brett directly into a small meeting room, no cameras. She placed the internal violation report on the table and looked him in the eye. "You knew they didn't speak English, but you still shouted at them, threatened them, called them sneaky illegals. What do you think that proves?" Brett didn't apologize, didn't deflect. His eyes were steady and hard. "I followed protocol. If they don't understand, then they shouldn't be here." There was a short silence, then Samada responded, her voice calmer than angry. "You followed procedure, but you're destroying the reason that procedure exists." She didn't request disciplinary action. She merely suggested reassigning Brett to administrative duty for 2 weeks to reassess his language conduct. The incident was removed from the class-widely review. No penalty. But Samata hand-wrote a note at the bottom of his ethics evaluation. "Discriminatory thinking within the context of power is a dangerous seed, even if no law has yet been broken." The note was submitted, then buried at the bottom of his file. No one revisited it, but Brett saw it, and what he remembered wasn't the warning, but the fact that she had seen through him. In a world where most people hid behind formal scripts, Samate's unflinching honesty, in his eyes, was unforgivable. After the internship, Brett wasn't kept on for excellence, and certainly not for ethics. He remained on the force for a far simpler reason. The department was understaffed, and within Millstone's bureaucratic machinery at the time, staffing decisions revolved solely around meeting minimum headcount, not character. He was assigned to patrol the city's highest immigrant district, precisely where he shouldn't have been. No one reviewed the ethics note Samata had signed. No one questioned why someone with quick reflexes but a record of racially charged language was sent to the front lines. All it took was one line: meets entry requirements and is ready for rotation. Samata was still there during her final weeks on assignment. She attended 2 briefing meetings after Brett's official deployment. In those rooms, Brett never greeted her, never looked, never smiled, but every time she spoke about the need to identify bias in evaluating suspect behavior, his gaze would lock onto her, not with anger, but something colder, more final and entirely dismissive. Samata didn't dwell on it. At the time, she had hundreds of files and jurisdictions to audit. She didn't have time to track a trainee just entering the system. But Brett, like a thorn that hadn't broken off, remained. Not large, not painful, but embedded too deep. When her assignment ended, Samata left Millstone. She didn't remember where Brett went after that. The reassignment system moved too fast, and internal reports stopped reaching her department. Everything moved on, everything went quiet. But years later, while handling a civil suit involving police misconduct in a neighboring state, the name Brett Halverson surfaced again. This time, no longer as a trainee, but as a senior response officer, with 3 withdrawn complaints and 1 case tied to the suicide of a minor. That's when Samata stopped, not because Brett had once defied her, not because of any personal grudge, but because she knew the system had seen the warning signs back in 2013 and chose to do nothing. Her warning had been there, written in black ink at the bottom of the report. Discriminatory thinking within the context of power is a dangerous seed, even if no law has yet been broken. But no one quoted it, no one digitized it, no one reviewed it. Like so many things in the system, it was pushed aside to avoid complications. Brett didn't need revenge. He didn't need to manipulate anything. He just needed the system not to ask questions. And the system, just like it always had, did its part perfectly. 3 days after the video clip of Samatha having a gun pointed at her went viral across social media platforms, the TikTok account @SilentWindow877, the user behind the 47-second video that rocked the media, suddenly disappeared. No announcement, no retraction, no goodbye, just gone, along with every post, every share, and over 5 million views in less than 72 hours. Samatha issued a sweep order that same night. The tech team traced the remaining digital signals from public data. The woman behind the account was identified as Eleanor Dwyer, 48 years old, a former high school English teacher who had taken early retirement due to health issues. She lived alone, had no children, no notable social affiliations, and no ties to any human rights or political organization. Just an ordinary person, except for one thing. She had the courage to hold up her camera at the exact moment no one else dared to film. A deeper check revealed anomalies. Eleanor's phone stopped working 2 days after the incident. Her last internet access came from a cheap suburban motel, located nowhere near her usual locations or any relatives. No credit card use, no bank transactions, no calls made, as if she had intentionally erased herself from existence. Samatha ordered a perimeter search. This was no longer about finding a witness. It was about finding someone who was retreating from the world, not because someone took her, but because fear had driven her to fold into a space too tight to breathe. They found Eleanor in a small second-floor room at the end of a hallway. The door was locked, curtains shut, lights off. No signs of physical violence, but her body was frail, hands shaking slightly, eyes sunken and fixated on the door, expecting someone to burst in. When she saw the uniformed figure, she flinched and ducked behind the bed, speechless. There was no need for questioning to understand. Eleanor hadn't been interrogated. She had been worn down by public backlash, by cruel comments, and by the deafening silence of a society split in two over what she captured. On the table sat a pile of printed pages, comments from under her video. Some read, "Bored old lady messing up society. Should be sued for filming cops. Who paid you to fake this?" And the worst, "One day you'll film the wrong person and never film again." Xantha understood right then. Eleanor didn't need to be interrogated. She needed to be protected. But more than that, she needed someone strong enough to say, "You were right," and no one will be allowed to make you apologize for it. Tamitha didn't arrive with a tactical team. No bodyguards, no government vehicle. She came in a long coat, unarmed, hair tied back, and knocked on the second-floor door with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Not the knock of authority, but of someone coming to talk, not command. Eleanor opened the door after standing behind the peephole for over a minute. Her eyes were still unstable. Her hands trembled, unlocking the door, which she only opened halfway. Samantha didn't state her identity. She didn't need to. Eleanor saw her, and in that brief moment, every wall she'd built crumbled. She stepped back, opening the door fully, not out of trust, but out of exhaustion. The room was unchanged. Curtains closed, lights off, desk covered in threats printed from the internet. Samantha walked in, didn't scan the space, didn't assess. She sat down across from the woman who had lived 3 days being flayed alive in public. No small talk. No, "Are you okay?" Samantha knew this was the kind of damage language couldn't mend. "I filmed because I thought it would help you," Eleanor said, voice raw. "But then I saw everyone just wanted me to shut up. Even the people who were supposed to protect you didn't stand up for me." Samantha nodded. She didn't deny it, didn't argue. She knew Eleanor's words weren't going to be corrected, they just needed to be heard. "I can't make them stop talking," Samantha replied, "but I can make sure they don't dare touch you." Eleanor looked at her, finally without looking away. "With your title?" she asked. Samantha shook her head. She pulled a sealed document from her coat pocket, a voluntary civilian witness protection agreement, issued by the Office for Special Judicial Coordination, an independent branch that protects individuals who provide evidence in cases involving abuse of authority. "The law," Samantha said, placing the folder on the table, "with something that means if they come near you, I personally, as someone accountable for the system, will testify. No press needed." Eleanor didn't respond, but her hand rested on the folder, not to sign it, just to touch it, to confirm it was real. Samantha stood up. She didn't push. She said nothing more. Before leaving, she turned back and said one thing. "You don't need to speak, don't need to explain, just keep living, and you've already beaten them." The door closed. In the dark room, only the breeze whispered outside in the hallway. But for Eleanor, for the first time in 3 days, something inside her finally stopped trembling, the belief that the truth she captured hadn't been abandoned. Just 4 hours after leaving Eleanor Dwyer's rented room, Samantha returned to headquarters and submitted a formal request to reopen the internal investigation into Officer Brett Halverson. She didn't consult anyone. She didn't wait for direction. She drafted it alone, every word chosen as if she might one day have to read it aloud before Congress. In the file, she listed not only the 3 complaints that had been withdrawn under suspicious circumstances, but also attached a video clip capturing the moment Brett pointed a gun at her despite no visible threat. Included was a summary of media response, the online community's crisis of trust, and an informal account, indirect testimony from Eleanor, who had disappeared from normal life simply for recording a truth too hard for society to digest. By regulation, the Office of Federal Internal Oversight was required to acknowledge receipt within 48 hours and issue a preliminary response within 5 business days. But after 72 hours, no confirmation, no request for clarification, No digital receipt. All communication channels returned the same automated message. File is currently under tiered review. Samantha accessed the internal case tracking system. Her eyes stopped at something strange. Her file had not been routed through the usual regional inspector level. Instead, it had been flagged with the code P5/X override, indicating it was being escalated directly into Level 5 security handling under an exceptional protocol. This designation applied only to cases involving undeclared congressional candidates under investigation, personnel involved in federal-level law enforcement strategy, matters potentially damaging to the overall image of the government. Samantha knew Brett didn't fall into any of those categories. He wasn't a candidate, not military, not a strategic advisor. By all accounts, he was just a frontline officer with a documented ethics warning and a record of inappropriate conduct. And yet, his name was being routed through a special security override. That meant someone didn't want Brett's file handled through the normal path. A day later, Samantha received a short call from an internal number. The voice on the line was an assistant from the coordination office. "We've received your file. However, we recommend holding off on publicly naming the individual under review for the sake of avoiding reputational damage not yet been substantiated. Public accusations during the review stage may lead to undesirable legal consequences." The voice was soft, polite, but firm. The final sentence rang out like a velvet-wrapped warning. "You understand the difference between what's right and what's wise." Samantha didn't respond. She just hung up. But in her mind, the question was already formed. Brett Halverson is being protected. By whom? She didn't need to guess names. She only had to trace the routing path, and she knew only a handful of people had the authority to change priority codes. Even fewer were willing to activate that level. For an officer who should have lost his badge 5 years ago, Samantha wasn't angry. She wasn't shaken, just cold. The kind of cold that settles in when you realize a place you once thought was built for justice is really just a management system for leaks. Not a mechanism to handle misconduct, but to make sure no one sees where it leaks to. She reopened Brett's file, wrote down 2 simple questions. For the first time, on paper. Who kept Brett in place? And what is Brett being used for? Samantha spent that evening in her office, overhead lights off. Only a desk lamp cast light onto a folder covered in handwritten notes, red underlines and webs of names connected by ink. Brett was no longer at the center. Every arrow pointed upward. She reopened the 2016 personnel chart, the year Brett was pulled from administrative support and reassigned to a special response unit. That was the turning point, when a man once formerly warm for public bias was moved into a position with high-pressure encounters, where the use of force was often tolerated before being scrutinized. Officially, that reassignment required 3 levels of approval: team supervisor, unit commander, and finally, the Deputy Director of Interregional Enforcement Strategy. That was the highest tier in the exception routing process, normally reserved for strategic retention of high-potential personnel. The name on the final approval line: Carolyn D. Yates, later appointed to the Interagency Advisory Group for the Department of Justice, specializing in optimization of rapid response deployment protocols, a role without investigative power, but with influence over how the system ran and who got to stay. Samantha pulled up Yates's older files. A law enforcement theorist, operational strategist, and author of a controversial 2015 policy paper that proposed, in an era of eroding public confidence in law enforcement, it is essential to retain personnel capable of rapid, decisive response, even if such responses occasionally exceed the emotional boundaries defined by formal training. At the time, the article caused an outcry. It was pulled from public databases within 48 hours. Brett Halverson, according to Samantha's trail, was one of a few tagged as decisive responder, non-emotive actor, capable of de-escalation through psychological pressure, a new kind of designation used in tactical units, but in reality, a license to legitimize behavioral patterns like Brett's. She understood now. Brett wasn't an outlier. He was a test case, a link, a pawn in a system that reshaped public perception using image control via controversial individuals. And if exposed, Brett wouldn't just bring down misconduct. He'd unravel a decision-making model currently being tested in other states. Samantha closed the file, looked up through the glass. Outside, snow had started to fall. Light, steady. Across the street, the administrative building glowed faint yellow, reflecting a different world, where memos, tiered reports, and internal routing were signed, stamped, and buried, not because the data was wrong, but because it was too accurate to survive. Brett was a product, but also a vulnerability. And if she touched him, really touched him, then every hand that signed off, defended, or enabled him would be forced into the light. This was no longer about investigating a police officer. This was about striking at how the system rewrote legitimacy without rewriting the law. Samantha stood. She didn't take the file. Just a scrap of paper on which she wrote 3 lines. This isn't about ethics or safety. This is power in its softest form, and I will expose it before it calcifies. Samantha knew that if she waited, everything would quietly disappear. The system didn't deny outright. It delayed, slowly drained momentum, wore people down with procedure. Instead of saying, "This can't be investigated," it would say, "Verification conditions not yet met." Instead of rejecting, it would acknowledge and forward. And by the time everyone had forgotten why the inquiry even mattered, it would conclude, "No grounds to proceed." She didn't need a formal hearing or a special task force. She needed the truth and people willing to survive alongside it. Within 2 days, Samantha reached out to 3 individuals who had stepped away from the core of the agency, but never from its original purpose. Deacon Shaw, once an internal behavioral analyst, now teaching at Quantico after resigning over a deliberately softened ethics report. Miguel Torres, a data savant who once recovered 37 GB from a wiped police abuse server, later told his findings were inadmissible. Instead of quitting, he built his own encrypted archive, a memory for what they want erased. And Lena Brooks, former crisis response lead who once dragged a suspect out of a burning cruiser, only to be reassigned for challenging a teammate's false statement. Her resignation note said, "If you fear truth this much, don't call yourselves law enforcement." Their first meeting was held in a nondescript basement room of an unlisted facility. No cameras, no official minutes, a mismatched table, foam walls, quiet resolve. Each arrived with their own pace, but the same eyes, direct, unflinching. Samantha offered no summary, no plan, only this: "I'm not here to investigate one man. I want to know why some men are never investigated." No one questioned her, because to expose one corrupt officer, you first have to understand the system that let him hide in plain sight. They formed a quiet unit, unnamed in official records. They didn't trust the system, not out of paranoia, but experience. All data remained offline, encrypted, hand-passed on secured drives. They called themselves Layer 9, a reference known only to those who'd worked above federal security, Tier 8. The 9th layer didn't exist on paper, yet every critical report was referenced through it before public release. Layer 9 wasn't a task force. It was memory recovery for decisions never recorded. 3 days in, Layer 9 discovered Brett Halverson was no anomaly. His file wasn't overlooked. It had been deliberately edited to protect his placement. Miguel unearthed data from a dormant regional security server, not a crime log, but a personnel network labeled Project G-Force. 27 officers with complaint histories, retained for use in high-pressure areas. Their qualification? Psychological pressure response capability. Brett was marked as one of 5 cleared for unsupervised field command. Deacon mapped 5 years of G-Forces deployments. The pattern was unmistakable. Vague suspect behavior reports, No body cam footage. Victims who dropped complaints after legal support was provided. Mateo Rivera's name surfaced. No officer listed, no image. But everything aligned. Brett wasn't a rogue. He was part of a design. They didn't need a report to see what this was. This wasn't misconduct. It was infrastructure. Samantha stood before a projected web of names, sanitized files, strategic retention tags. She spoke softly. We're not investigating Brett anymore. We're unmasking a generation bred for suppression by instinct. Lena stared at Mateo's name, then at Brett's. If this is their standard response, then we need a new one, before it kills another child. Miguel nodded. Deacon was already encrypting evidence. Layer 9 had crossed the line from observation to preparation. They were compiling a shadow file, one no agency could claim ignorance of, and Samantha knew, once that file was complete, the only question left wouldn't be who did wrong, it would be who kept them in place and why. Lena requested that the Mateo Rivera case file be reopened, just as the Layer 9 team was drowning in a flood of personnel data showing signs of tampering. But for Lena, the Mateo case wasn't about adding evidence. She needed to know not what Brett had done, but what the system had rewritten in place of the boy. The original file was retrieved by Miguel from a local server, accessed through the Education Department's backup storage. The full document had never been released. Only a summary used in internal reports. No signs of criminal conduct. Officer followed standard response protocol under suspicion of potential threat. And from there, everything stopped. But reading the full file revealed something blinding. How a 17-year-old student, bright, well-behaved, never disciplined, was portrayed as a threat. Mateo Rivera, 11th grade, GPA 3.9, debate club captain, summer scholarship recipient for minority law students, a joint program across 3 Ivy League universities, clean academic record, no history of violence. Yet all of that was erased with a single opening line in Brett Halverson's report. The subject displayed defiant behavior, stepped backward upon approach, and clutched his backpack, requiring me to take control due to suspicion of a concealed weapon. No footage, because the camera system had a technical malfunction. No witnesses, because the hall monitor had stepped into the adjacent office, and the suspicious item turned out to be a plastic anatomy model and a Spanish-language law book Mateo had prepared for a presentation titled Enforcement Policy and Psychological Impact in Schools. The presentation was never given. Mateo was subdued by Brett in front of a few stunned students who stood too far to intervene. He was slammed down, handcuffed, and taken to the precinct. During the 2 hours he was held, there was no guardian, no lawyer, no recording. The report said, subject is underage for formal charge. Incident resolved with educational citation and release. After returning home, Mateo said nothing. He filed no complaint, told no one. A week later, he stopped going to school. 2 weeks after that, his mother, Lucia Rivera, noticed he wouldn't leave his room, wouldn't eat, wouldn't smile, wouldn't speak. He only wrote. A lot. The last thing he handed his homeroom teacher was an essay titled, Who Gets to Decide Who I Am? No one read it. No one got to ask him that question back. 1 month after the incident, Mateo hanged himself in the old school building. The school issued no alert. The press said nothing. The case was closed with a phrase as cold as concrete. No external influence detected. Possible academic or psychological stress. Lucia took the documents everywhere, but no one accepted her petition. They said there was no basis for a claim, that Brett had followed protocol, and they told her, gently, to focus on healing. Brett's file was never changed. No warnings, no review, no reassignment. His report remained the official record, while Mateo's essay, never cited, was forgotten. Samantha reread the file. She didn't cry, but her eyes were slow, sharp, like a blade pressing through the language. Words like erratic behavior, non-compliant, uncooperative subject, repeated across 11 other G-Force cases. Mateo wasn't the first, but he was the first with a real name, and now, to Layer 9, He wouldn't be just another red mark in a forgotten file. He would be the reason this system would never again be allowed to bury a child under the phrase, acted according to protocol. Most traces of Mateo Rivera had been scrubbed from official platforms. His name no longer appeared in any district report after the incident. His graduation photo was taken off the school website. The memorial was canceled for logistical reasons, and the article about his scholarship in the student pride section was replaced by another student same year. Lucia still lived in the same apartment, still walked to the mailbox each morning with slow, stiff steps, still worked part-time at the laundromat. She never spoke about Mateo, but she had never let go of him either. When Samothy arrived, no introduction was needed. Lucia opened the door, walked to the living room, opened a drawer beneath the sofa, and handed her a stack of papers wrapped in plastic, edges still creased by the hands of a child who never got the chance to correct his grammar. At the top of the first page was a messy, bold title, "Who Gets to Decide Who I Am?" The essay wasn't long, but each line struck the conscience like a soft, steady knock. I was born here, but every time someone asks, "Where are you from?" I don't know what to say, not because I lack papers, but because I'm not white enough for anyone to believe I have them. When my teacher said justice is for everyone, I believed it, until someone I didn't know told me to lie down because I didn't answer fast enough, and the whole school believed that was fair. I don't want to write a charge sheet. I want to rewrite how people see me, not to be pitied, but to be treated like I have memory. Like I won't be erased just because someone is uncomfortable. At the bottom, a small, final line, "If I don't get to speak while I'm alive, I hope someone reads this when I'm gone." Lucia gently touched that last line, said nothing, didn't pull her hand back. Samantha didn't promise anything, didn't offer comfort. She simply folded the page, sealed it in a moisture-proof envelope, signed and dated it, then filed it in Layer 9's archive, next to the entire GFOR's dataset. She didn't treat it as evidence, she treated it as a beginning. That night, she sent a confidential internal memo to exactly 7 people, 1 regional commander, 2 civil policy supervisors, 1 federal disciplinary chief, and 3 original signatories of G-Force. The memo had only 3 items. Attached file. Mateo Rivera's essay. Note, this boy wrote what none of you had the courage to say. Closing sentence, we won't stay silent anymore, and this time, no one's name will be erased. Samantha was in a meeting with Layer 9 when her personal phone buzzed. An unknown number, area code matching, no U.S. state. Not a work line, not a monitored device. She stared at the screen for 3 seconds, then signaled the group to pause. No words, no urgency. She stepped outside, gently closed the door, and answered. On the other end, a male voice, low and hoarse. No greeting, no confirmation. Just 1 sentence. The documents will arrive within 36 hours. Don't use the internal network. Use an isolated device. Then it cut off. No callback signal, no trace, just a flicker of intent. But enough for Sama to know the source she thought had vanished was still alive, and not just alive, still watching, still choosing the moment. 2 days later, a hand-delivered package was signed for at her secondary office. No sender name, no system tag. Inside was a 1 TB military-grade hard drive, matte steel casing, shock-protected. Alongside it was a handwritten note, slightly slanted but precise. This is the unstructured version, enough to bury the entire mitigation through politicage logic. Don't trust the system to fix itself. No signature, no symbol. But Samothy knew it wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. She brought the hard drive to the basement, the only network-isolated room in the entire headquarters. Under the dull yellow light and the hum of ventilation, she powered up an independent machine and connected the drive using the most basic interface. No network, no auto-run software. The screen displayed a raw directory tree. No flashy titles, no interface. Just dry file manual, but enough to make everyone in the room free. RPLF form _ deletion chain, internal directive _ reflex compliance. Moderator report _ batch _ 31C, level 5 _ joint policy _ exception memo. Each file a marker, not of misconduct, but of a system that had learned how to reformat the very idea of wrongdoing. Lena, who had overseen enforcement files during crisis cases, was the first to open one. She said nothing, just stared. Miguel moved to decode metadata. Deacon began mapping logical chains, not in order of incidents but by instructions: mitigation, post-action discourse reframing, and preserving institutional trust. Samata didn't have to speak. She knew. They knew. And this time the truth wasn't buried somewhere. It was right here, encrypted, wrapped in language clean enough to prevent public suspicion. But for Layer 9, that language was about to be unraveled, byte by byte. The largest file on the drive was named reflex_compliance_manual_V3.2. Not a misconduct report, not surveillance logs, a formal instruction manual, used to handle incidents where officers were accused of excessive force, with the goal of media de-escalation and institutional trust preservation. The internal release note stated for use only by regional response leadership and strategic comms divisions, not to be distributed through civilian T-back channels. Samata and Layer 9 read every page. Miguel pulled metadata. The manual had been revised at least 7 times between 2017 and 2022, meaning it wasn't an accident. It was a policy refined over time. Each year, the language shifted. Every major social incident, George Floyd, Tyree Nichols, led to a new refresh of the text, not to change behavior, but to change post-incident language. The first line of the objectives section was clear. Immediate frontline reactions under high-stress conditions may create misunderstandings about legitimacy, if not properly communicated. The next, this document provides guidance on adjusting terminology, imagery, and report formatting to ensure unexpected situations are not mischaracterized. Lena frowned, flipping ahead to Section 3, Behavior Description Conversion. There, a table listed translations such as physical restraint, implementation of situational stabilization measures, subject non-resistant, subject displaying unclear physical intent, unarmed, potential threat not yet excluded, no medical request, situation not requiring additional intervention. Samantha didn't nod or shake her head. She simply placed her finger on a line in Section 4.0. In the absence of independent witnesses, prioritized the phrase, response based on professional judgment under time-sensitive stress conditions. Deacon copied the sentence in red ink. No further explanation needed. It meant, if no one's filming, they can rewrite the entire story under internal logic. The second file, Mandrator Report_Batch_31C, was a record of 54 cases across 5 years that applied internal post-incident handling per the manual. 11 of those listed were from the G-Force unit, including Brett Halverson. The case involving Mateo Rivera appeared at line 19, with the note, processed per community response standardization, no press involvement necessary. Authentication code, confirmed by Interregional Coordination Office, code CLY5. Miguel's voice dropped. I used to think the data was hidden, but it's not. It's publicly maintained, just written in a language the system has trained itself to render unquestionable, Lena whispered. This isn't concealment. This is a parallel version of the truth. Samantha stood, unplugged the hard drive, and carefully placed it back into its anti-interference case. She looked at the Layer 9 planning board, struck through an old note, find structural cover-up evidence, then replaced it with a new line, written in firm black ink. We don't need to expose the guilty. We need to force the system to admit it was built to protect them. Miguel was the first to discover it. While scanning the metadata of the file, moderator report _batch_31DC, he found a stray annotation that didn't belong to any formal category, buried between 2 seemingly harmless periodic reports. The line had no author, no reference code, and no numbering, but Miguel recognized the fingerprints of something meant to slide by unnoticed. It was a terse command, stripped of context. Individuals who resist internal investigative protocols should be assessed as potential threats to organizational cohesion. If unmanageable through standard processes. Activate soft neutralization via reassignment, passive monitoring, or task isolation within the tiered structure. Deacon, reading over his shoulder, recited it aloud, word by word, as if testing whether he'd misread it. Soft neutralization, a phrase absent from any official manual, yet unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough time inside the system. It meant keep someone in the role, but strip them of weight. Still present in meetings, but unheard. Still holding a title, but irrelevant. It was erasure without erasing. Immediately after the command appeared a short list of 5 names, marked with shorthand codes and notes. 4 were already no longer active in strategic positions. The 5th, its line struck through but recoverable via metadata, brought silence to the room. S. Johnson, risk level, subordinate opinion manipulation. Lena's reaction was calm. Deacon held the file tighter. Miguel said nothing. Samantha stood, impassive but fully aware. This wasn't generated randomly. Someone had marked her long ago, not for misconduct but for nonconformity. She remembered her suspension 10 years ago. The reason given was pending investigation of potential media leaks, but the truth was that she had refused to turn over a list of journalists who accessed internal complaints from an Oklahoma branch. She didn't believe in source hunting. For that, she was suspended. The order was signed by Douglas K. Phelps, then Chief of Internal Investigations, now Brett Halverson's supervisor in the Interregional Office. At the time, Samantha didn't speak out. No interviews, no lawsuits. She quietly stepped back for 3 months, dissected the disciplinary code line by line, and returned not as a subject under scrutiny, but as the person who could rebuild the very system that had tried to eject her. But now, seeing her name on a target list marked for neutralization, she saw the truth. What happened a decade ago wasn't a fluke. It was a deliberate first move in a long game of suppression, sold under the label of organizational stability. No one in the room asked, "Are you sure?" No one suggested a double check. They all understood. When a system labels someone based on their capacity to disrupt, not by wrongdoing but by refusal to conform, then justice is no longer the purpose. And when manipulating subordinate opinion is attached to someone who simply asks hard questions, the message is clear. Truth itself is a threat. Deacon folded the metadata printout in half, his voice low and heavy. So this started before Brett ever pulled a gun, before Mateo died. Samantha nodded. She knew. The origins never start where the public looks. They start in directives with no sender, yet always an executor. This time, she would not allow it to be deleted. Lena instructed Miguel to pull every policy proposal on internal investigative reform from the last 7 years, focusing on files marked approved but unissued. In a data set from the Rapid Response Oversight Committee, formed after backlash in 2020 over excessive force, they found an anomaly. Policy_Overwatch_V1.6 draft. It had never been released publicly. Metadata showed it had been uploaded at 3:47 IEM, an off-schedule timestamp, and shared with only 5 director-level email addresses. Inside, buried under the section Policy and Personnel Risk Considerations, was a hidden comment block only visible to admin level 4 and above. Miguel decrypted it. It wasn't personal commentary. It was a threat matrix based on internal influence, evaluating personnel on 3 factors: ability to transmit information outside protocol, impact on team morale, and degree of non-alignment with administrative direction. 12 names appeared. None accused, none investigated, but all marked for passive monitoring and restricted counterbalance roles. The last name on the list, Samantha L. Johnson, not accompanied by any misconduct, just a comment, consistently advocates for transparency in internal audit procedures, favors independent review over consensus compliance, high influence among mid-tier personnel, if retained in strategic role may compromise control over information flow. Deacon read it aloud, No one interrupted, but silence fell, not from shock but recognition. It confirmed what they already suspected. Samantha had never truly been seen as part of the system, even as she worked tirelessly for it. Even at its highest levels, she remained a risk, not for what she'd done, but because she wouldn't stay quiet. Lena reopened the charter that had authorized the G-Force initiative. She traced the name of the person who signed it. Carolyn D. Yates, the same person behind several reports suppressing investigations into excessive force. Yates had never named Samantha directly, but once wrote in a confidential memo, "Personnel who overemphasize transparency may unintentionally cause internal instability. Under pressure, unity is more vital than scrutiny." Samantha understood. People like Yates, like Phelps, didn't need proof to act against her. They just needed to know she had enough credibility to make others start questioning, and in a structure built on collective silence, that was unacceptable. Miguel hit print. A page slid out bearing the title, "Forecast: Individuals with Counter-Narrative Influence on Organizational Behavior." He placed it on the table, nudged it toward Samantha. She didn't pick it up. She looked at it, then wrote one sentence in her notebook. "If they see me as the problem, then I've chosen the right side." There was no banner, no flag salute, no golden eagle on a podium. Samantha Johnson didn't follow standard federal ceremonial protocol, but she didn't break it either. She moved in the gray zone, where the law hadn't forbidden, but those in power had never encouraged anyone to step. A press bulletin, just 3 lines long, had been quietly released. "The director of the FBI will make a live statement at federal headquarters at 9 a.m. No questions, no live stream." No one knew the content, no media pre-brief, no internal memo, yet within 30 minutes of that message spreading, the plaza outside the federal hall was packed, not just with reporters, but with federal employees, lawyers, political science students, and everyday citizens who had followed the story with what the media had called an unanswered urgency. Samantha didn't walk out with military escort, had no bodyguards guiding her path, no bulletproof glass shielding the stage. She walked alone, wearing a dark coat, no insignia. In her right hand was a thin file, unmarked, unbranded, with only one line handwritten in black ink on plain white paper. P5/GX4/clearance chain exception. A line not found in any public federal documentation, but anyone who had handled high clearance dossiers knew it. It was internal code for command chains that had been bypassed for oversight. She stepped onto the platform. No mic adjustments, no greetings. Her first words were already the statement. "Today, I'm not here to talk about myself. I won't talk about the gun pointed at me. I won't talk about who tried to silence me. I'm here to speak about what should have been investigated 10 years ago, but was withheld by those who believed they had the right to redefine truth." The air dropped flat. No applause, no interruptions. She opened the folder and laid each document on the podium. Directives on reflex compliance, a list of 22 incidents involving G-Force officers, screenshots of internal commands marking individuals as soft neutralization targets, and most notably, a media risk assessment in which Samantha herself had been classified as an ideological disruption for her efforts to increase transparency in investigative procedures. She didn't explain each page. No storytelling, no emotion, just facts, dates, signatures, content consequences. The numbers told the story. Within the federal system, a second tier of command had existed, and still existed, one that didn't need to be written because it had been normalized in silence. A tier not born from law, but from the compromise between power and the fear of public reaction. She finished precisely 9 minutes after she started. No raising of voice, no dramatic pause. The final sentence was delivered slowly, clearly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "If we still call this a law enforcement agency, then we must ask, what law allowed this to exist?" There was no applause, just a silence, brief but heavy. Then microphones clicked on. Reporters pulled out laptops. Her final words spread across every platform within the hour. But it wasn't the words that made it viral. It was the tone of someone who no longer asked permission to speak. And from that moment on, Samantha Johnson was no longer the official under review for excessive influence on subordinates. She was the one who had publicly challenged a nation. Who gets to speak the truth, and why must they wait their turn? Within 2 hours of the briefing, major media, from legacy newspapers to digital forums, had posted, reposted, dissected her words. No one asked whether she had felt threatened. No one focused on the gun pointed at her. They didn't need to. The story she chose to tell wasn't personal. It was a blueprint for institutional manipulation, written in official language, the kind that forces anyone who had ever signed off on anything to look not in the mirror, but in the paper trail marked "handled internally." The spotlight shifted from individual to system. Media outlets didn't dwell on Samantha's tone. They broke down every document, every file ID, every timestamp she revealed. And what shocked the public wasn't just the misconduct. It was the pattern, the language, the repeated pair of signatures. GF Force, a term never listed in legal reports or public policy, suddenly became a national keyword. Within 12 hours, over 20 previously controversial but unprosecuted cases were cross-checked by independent journalists. They found a chilling thread. Most officers present at those scenes were on Samantha's disclosed list, and in most of those cases, the victims weren't alive to testify. The Federal Congressional Oversight Committee immediately convened an emergency session. A group of representatives demanded urgent access to all data Samantha presented. No one questioned the authenticity of the files anymore. They questioned the systemic consistency of the cover-up. Their first inquiries weren't about Brett Halverson or frontline officers. They asked, who approved these reduced evaluations? Who decided that people like Samantha were ideological risks? And how could a parallel clearance list operate outside congressional purview for so long? Public response shifted faster than anyone anticipated, not out of sympathy for Samantha, but out of recognition. If what she said was true, then no one was outside the system. Anyone could be next. Anyone could be classified non-compliant for not bowing fast enough. And if an FBI director could be held at gunpoint just for not fitting the neighborhood, what chance did a 17-year-old like Mateo ever have? Samantha gave no interviews afterward. She didn't need to. Everything she had to say had been said, and Layer 9, once a shadow cell in a secure basement, was no longer anonymous. They received a formal request from the Congressional Special Missions Office, full data handover and access to the original investigative timeline. And for the first time in 2 decades, a non-traditional investigative unit was granted advisory presence at a federal hearing. What started as Samantha's lone act of resistance had become a dual-pressure mechanism, social and institutional. People no longer asked, was there misconduct? But instead, who engineered the system so that misconduct never had to surface? And the most important question, repeated not just in hearings but in law classrooms, justice panels, and evening broadcasts, was this: where does truth find protection when the system is built to protect the ones who distort it? The memorial was announced late the night before. No FBI logo, no federal backdrop. Samantha posted a single line on the internal network and let her assistant forward it to media outlets. This is not a press conference. This is a place to read the names of those who once existed. Time, 8:00 AEME. Location, Langston Park, a patch of grass between 2 aging neighborhoods, once the site where a child was restrained for carrying a water gun. There was no rain, no sun, no music, no banners. A simple wooden platform stood on the grass. Behind it, a large whiteboard bore a handwritten line, the names never entered in the report. No security fence, no metal detectors. A small group of citizens stood waiting, not shouting, not holding signs, just standing, arms folded, gazes fixed on the platform like waiting for something no one quite had words for. Samantha arrived on time, alone. A gray coat, a folder tied with a thin piece of twine. She stepped up, gave no opening remarks, offered no context or explanation. She simply opened the folder and began to read. Each name landed like a cut, not because of how she spoke, but because she didn't pause to explain. Each line, name, age, location, no tragic details, no tears, no moral framing. Samata understood when someone dies without a sentence to describe them, what they need isn't pity, it's to be remembered by name. The list continued, 42 names. Some familiar, once in headlines, now forgotten. Others never mentioned, buried in files marked unprosecutable due to lack of visual evidence. Some died at school, some at bus stops, some at the hands of decorated officers, some at the hands of those currently up for promotion. By the 30th name, Samatha's voice dropped, not from emotion but breath. She paused, not bowing, not wiping her face, then continued. When the list ended, she stood still. No one stepped forward, no questions. The crowd was silent. Wind carried a few handwritten slips off the platform. An older woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A young man lowered his head, fists clenched in his coat pockets. A child clung to their mother's coat hem, as if afraid someone might say their name next. But no one spoke, not because they didn't know what to say, but because they knew anything said wouldn't be enough. Samatha looked at the board behind her. The words remained bold, like they had become a document more powerful than any official report. She gave no closing statement, no press release. She simply folded the folder, set it down, and stepped off the platform, leaving behind 42 names, still and sharp like an indictment that didn't need the word crime. The memorial wasn't streamed, no broadcast. But within an hour, each name had been photographed and shared online. People retyped every line by hand, as if making a silent vow: if the justice system won't speak their names, the people will. No one noticed the woman arrive. No escort, no introduction, just a small figure in a pale, lead-colored coat holding something wrapped in a white cloth. As Samatha stepped down, before she could close the event, the woman's voice rang out, not through a microphone, not loud, but so clear that even those in the back turned their heads. The park froze for a second. The woman was Lucia Rivera, Mateo's mother, a woman who, for the last 10 years, had lived as if her son's name would never be said again. Samatha stopped. She didn't nod. She didn't stop her either. She simply stepped aside, leaving the mic open. Lucia approached the platform, not looking at the crowd nor the cameras now rising. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was an old photograph. Mateo, standing in front of a classroom whiteboard, holding a plastic anatomy model, eyes bright, as if nothing in the world could stop him from dreaming. She placed the photo on the edge of the platform. No one instructed her where to hold it. No one adjusted anything. She didn't care. Her voice was steady, calm, not angry. I didn't come here to ask for justice for my son. Mateo isn't coming back. Justice doesn't change that. I came for the children who haven't been taken yet, for the mothers who haven't been forced to sign withdrawal forms. I don't need the police to apologize. I don't need the school to make a tribute video. I just need them to stop erasing names. Lucia bowed slightly, eyes lingering on the photo one last time. Then, holding the microphone in both hands, she said she didn't thank anyone, didn't bow. She returned the mic to its stand like she had never touched it, then turned and walked off, passing Samatha without eye contact. She didn't need to say anything. They had understood each other from the first meeting, when Lucia closed the door on Samatha, saying, "I have nothing left to believe." And today, she didn't come because she believed again. She came because belief isn't a prerequisite so long as someone is still standing to speak. As Lucia walked away, Samatha bowed her head. No final speech, no follow-up program. The crowd stayed still, as if waiting for a signal to leave, but no one wanted to move first, because in that quiet morning moment, everyone knew nothing was more sacred than having someone else speak the name of the one you lost in their own voice. Mateo's photo remained on the platform, untouched by wind. No frame, no tape, no spotlight. And yet, everyone remembered it, not because of the image itself, but because of the question he once asked. which, finally, someone else had answered. The hearing was scheduled just 3 days after the press conference, so fast that many senators couldn't rearrange their calendars in time, yet none dared to be absent. Presiding was Senator Julian Parr, long a vocal critic of police abuse of power, though he had never received hard data substantial enough to force institutional accountability. Now, in front of him stood the first person to publicly name an entire protection apparatus, not with accusations, but with digital evidence that could not be denied. The congressional hearing room was packed. Seated at the table were senior officials from the FBI, Department of Justice, Internal Affairs Bureau, and 2 members of the Federal Security Oversight Committee. All had received summary documents prepared by the Layer 9 team. But what they weren't prepared for was how Samatha would begin. She didn't read a statement, didn't hold notes, didn't ask to share personal views. She walked up, stood tall, looked each person in the eye, and said 3 opening sentences. I am the director of the FBI. I am not here to defend personal reputation. I am here to report that the very system I lead has been structured to bypass justice when the violator wears the right uniform. No one interrupted. No one objected. Her first line had already stripped the hearing of its safety zone. Samatha broke down each section, not to target Brett Halverson, not starting with the gun incident, but with Mateo's withdrawn case file. She began with the term reflex compliance from internal policy, with annotations redacted from official copies, with the fact that a mother, stripped of any faith in the system, still had to carry the weight of a report with no footage, no camera, and no accountability. When she described the mechanism of soft nullification, senators started exchanging glances. When she named the approver behind the mitigation clauses, documents flipped instantly to the appendix. And when she read the exact metadata line that had struck her name from the FBI strategic staffing list for influencing subordinate ideology, the room fell completely silent. The questioning phase began, but no one asked about personal events. The same question echoed repeatedly: why have these facts never appeared through official channels? Samatha answered without blinking: because the system wasn't built to find truth. It was built to contain damage from the truth. That afternoon, the committee issued an emergency summons for Lieutenant Brett Halverson, not for pointing a gun at Samatha, but for a decade-long pattern of red fag indicators systematically overlooked. His actions were no longer seen as isolated incidents. They were the inevitable endpoint of a process that had been quietly tolerated. Brett entered the chamber in a pale gray suit, no longer in uniform. He sat across from the committee, permitted to speak only through his appointed attorney. But the attorney had little room to maneuver. The evidence Samatha had presented had already been verified by independent analysts and accepted as official exhibits. This was no longer about personal misconduct. A senator read aloud: on June 14, 2014, you subdued a 17-year-old student at Millstone High citing suspicion of a dangerous object. Your report stated, subject displayed non-cooperative behavior, but recovered files identify the student as Mateo Rivera, an honors student, no record, no weapon, and school surveillance shows a 4-minute blackout. Brett said nothing. Another senator followed. Why, in all 3 official complaints, were the cases withdrawn within 72 hours, signed off by your direct superior, Douglas Phelps, the same man who suspended Director Johnson for non-cooperation with internal review? Brett's lawyer moved to halt the hearing, but the chair rejected it. This isn't about your current legal status, he said. This is about how you passed every oversight scan without anyone raising an ethical flag. Samatha sat motionless. She didn't participate in the questioning, but her eyes stayed on the open file in front of her. The bold text: Halverson, Brett, Gorson Unit, Level 3, Protection Priority. That line wasn't from any civilian system. It was buried in a classified coordination tier, one editable by a fixed group only. And that was the real issue. Deacon, Lena, and Miguel were all present. Lena whispered, "He's not the problem." Miguel nodded. The problem is who programmed the system to think he was worth protecting. Samatha didn't respond. She already knew. Today's hearing wasn't to send Brett to prison. It was to expose the chilling truth that if left unchecked, the system would retain anyone who knew how to commit violence the right way, as long as they didn't make the system look bad. At the close of the hearing, a final question was asked. Lieutenant Halverson, do you believe that if the woman you pointed your gun at hadn't been the director of the FBI, you would still be working today without an investigation? Brett said nothing, but his face gave it away. And that silence was the clearest admission of all. For the first time, media headlines didn't lead with the victim's name. Instead, they asked a single haunting question. If the system doesn't protect the truth, then who is it protecting? No one expected it to end this way. No handcuffs. No one led out in front of cameras. No dramatic statements from prosecutors. But that was exactly what made this change feel real. It didn't begin with a courtroom, but with a hearing. And it didn't end with a verdict, but with a law named after a child who would never live to know he'd become the face of overdue justice. 3 weeks after the historic hearing, a bipartisan group in Congress submitted Bill FJ 2447. Its contents, a mandated internal review process for any officer previously accused of excessive force, regardless of whether the complaint was withdrawn. The official name, the Mateo Act, named after Mateo Rivera, a 17-year-old boy who hanged himself after being slammed to the ground and held at the precinct without a guardian present, suspected of non-cooperative behavior by Lieutenant Brett Halverson. No one objected to the bill's name. No lawmaker asked to tone down the emotion, because after the evidence released by Layer 9, every counter-argument collapsed under the weight of the data. Over 10 years, there had been 42 similar cases, most never prosecuted, and in over half, the victims had posed no recorded threat to officers' lives. The Mateo Act wasn't passed to polish a political legacy. It existed because the system needed a mechanism so it wouldn't have to apologize again. The bill had 3 core provisions. First, all withdrawn complaints over the past 15 years must be reevaluated if the accused officer was involved in any later use-of-force incident. No exceptions. No seniority-based immunity. Second, any forceful restraint exceeding protocol, such as detaining an unarmed individual beyond a legal time limit, would automatically trigger a federal-level investigation if no resolution occurred within 90 days. Third, any loss of body cam footage during duty must be reported and data recovered within 48 hours, or the equipment manager, not the on-scene officer, would face a hearing. No one claimed the Mateo Act was a perfect fix, but it was the first time Congress passed legislation not to deal with the aftermath but to prevent the pattern from repeating. In the sessions, no lawmaker recited poetry, no one shared family anecdotes, only data and excerpts from internal policies that once hid wrongdoing behind sanitized language. Reflex compliance, behavioral justification, contextualized incident memory. Those phrases now replaced by a single name, Mateo. When the bill passed with 341 votes in the House and 62 in the Senate, no one stood to celebrate. But in a small home on the outskirts of Millstone, Lucia Rivera, the mother who had declined every interview, who had kept her doors closed for a decade, sat in her kitchen, listening to the last line of the news broadcast, the Mateo Act, the first federal law requiring the system to revisit the very harm it once refused to acknowledge. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, not in thanks, but in recognition of something her son once believed. Justice doesn't need to be fast, but it must arrive. Samantha made no public statements about the law. She didn't go on air, she didn't post online, but she made one request, that the original photo of Mateo be hung in the 4th-floor hallway of the FBI building, where use-of-force training was held. No caption, no frame, just a reminder, if you forget who had to die, you'll find it easier to repeat what killed them. A week after the Mateo Act passed, Samantha appeared in a short, pre-recorded video, not broadcast live, not aired nationally. She didn't pick a dramatic backdrop, didn't walk out from a high-rise office, didn't sit behind an FBI emblem. Just a wooden chair, a camera lens, and a plain white background. No studio lighting, no soundtrack. Just the way she always chose to speak, direct, honest, and stripped of polish. She didn't thank anyone. She didn't declare victory. She didn't recount the journey. Instead, she looked into the camera, her voice steady and flat. Some people will say she's brave, but I have to say this. I don't want to be brave. I don't believe anyone should have to be brave just to survive a traffic stop or to stay alive standing on a sidewalk. She paused, not for effect, but to breathe, then continued. I don't want to be a symbol. I don't need a hashtag with my name on it. I didn't do this for credit, and I don't want to be celebrated. I did this because people like Mateo never got the chance to tell anyone what happened. The camera didn't zoom in. It stayed fixed. She tilted her head slightly, as if speaking to one person on the other side of the screen. I just want that when a woman sits in her car driving home, with nothing but her phone and her wallet, she doesn't have to ask herself, will the color of my skin kill me today? She didn't say it angrily, nor softly to ask for sympathy. It sounded like a note, something someone would scrawl on a wall, where lawmakers might read it before they draft the next policy. In that moment, there were no claps. No one shouted, "That's right." But within 24 hours of the video going live on a non-commercial platform, the clip spread not through auto shares, but because people started typing her final sentence by hand. Not because it was eloquent, but because it was true. And because they knew, in a society where staying alive means looking unthreatening, then that society is not free. After the recording, Samantha didn't give any more interviews. She declined all book offers, refused every film adaptation deal, turned down civic awards. When a reporter asked, "Do you think you changed anything?" she answered, "If I helped one boy keep his name in the record instead of being rewritten as non-compliant subject, that's enough." When the camera turned off, she removed her mic herself, unclipped her collar, didn't wait for help. A technician said they'd adjust the lighting and add captions. She replied, "Don't edit it, keep the lighting flat. People need to see I'm no different from them." Then she left through the front door. That day, no statue was built in Sameth's name, but at a small school in Millstone, where Mateo once studied, students asked to pin a single sentence on the hallway bulletin board. Wondering if your skin will get you killed should never be a habit. And in that silence, the story didn't end, but it was no longer just someone else's. Samantha Johnson's story didn't begin with an investigation. It began with a gun. Not in the hands of a criminal, but in the hands of someone trained to protect. Not aimed at a suspect, but at a black woman sitting in her own car, unarmed, showing no threat, guilty only of not looking like she belonged in the neighborhood. But the real issue wasn't in that single moment. It was in the entire structure that made sure that moment wasn't the first and wouldn't have been the last if she hadn't spoken up. From that personal story, 3 powerful lessons emerge, not just for those involved, but for anyone who has ever assumed that justice is automatic. First, don't judge others based on bias. Through the windshield, Lieutenant Brett Halverson saw a lone black woman with no badge, no visible ID, and assumed she didn't belong. What he didn't know was that he was facing the FBI director, someone with access to data he never thought anyone would check. The truth is, across hundreds of similar incidents each year, those targeted don't have credentials to flash, no camera recording, no name high enough to shield them. All they have is the burden of someone else's prejudice and the consequences it brings. Second, people's talent and worth cannot be dismissed just because they don't fit society's safe mold. Samantha was once suspended from her senior role for refusing to turn over a list of press contacts. Mateo, a brilliant Latino student with no record of misconduct, was treated like a threat and erased from every record as if he had never existed. These individuals weren't lacking competence or character, they were only lacking one thing: the privilege of being seen as non-threatening when silent. But this story proves that real strength doesn't come from being accepted from the start. It comes from what you do when you're pushed aside, dismissed, erased. The third, and most vital lesson. Justice can still win, not because the system corrects itself, but because someone chose to keep the evidence, because someone dared to say the name that was forgotten, because someone said, "I don't need to be a symbol. I just don't want others to wonder whether their skin color might get them killed during a traffic stop." These actions, these voices, won't change everything overnight, but they are enough to get a law passed, a review policy rewritten, and a cover-up called what it is. Not internal response, but institutional evasion. This isn't a story told to condemn a man. It's not told to praise a single hero. It's a reminder. Every time we stay silent in the face of injustice, the system learns how to function without being questioned. And if an FBI director can be labeled a threat to subordinate ideological cohesion just for demanding transparency, what does that say about how easily ordinary people are categorized? We don't share this story to make you cry. We share it to make you think. And if you've ever been in a similar situation, with no camera, no title, and no one on your side, remember, you're not wrong just because someone doesn't understand you. Have you ever been misjudged because of your skin, your name, or your zip code? Boxed in before anyone asked who you really are? Have you ever been dismissed, sidelined, told to tone it down, only to quietly prove you were more capable than they expected? If you've ever answered yes to any of that, then this story is also yours. And if this story made you pause, even for a minute, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Not because we need the views, but because someone like Mateo deserves to be remembered by name. Tell this story so that someone sitting in their car today, hand on their wallet, heart pounding, unsure of who's about to knock on their window, might feel, for once, like they'll be seen as a human being. Finally, don't forget to follow us for more stories like this, not because we're good storytellers, but because you deserve to know this. Justice may fall silent, but it doesn't die. Not as long as someone keeps it alive with memory, with questions, and with action. A heartfelt thank you to my viewers. First and foremost, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to all of you, those who have taken the time to watch, support, and join me on this journey with my channel. Your presence is an immense source of motivation, a spark that fuels my passion and drives me to keep pushing forward and creating. Every view, every comment, every share is not just a number, it's a testament to the connection, trust, and love you've shown for the content I bring to you. I understand that in today's world, overflowing with information, your choice to pause, watch, and engage with my channel is truly special. It's not just recognition, it's inspiration for me to strive for better. I know this journey isn't always smooth, and my content may not always be perfect, but thanks to your honest feedback, both positive and constructive, I've learned how to improve, innovate, and deliver content that's more meaningful and impactful. I am committed to continuously improving, to bring you the highest quality content. Every video, every post, every idea is crafted with my whole heart, aiming not only to entertain but also to inspire, spark positivity, and add value to our community. I listen closely to you, my incredible supporters, to understand what you expect and desire. This drives me to enhance the quality of my work, refine my presentation, and invest in fresh, creative ideas so that every visit to my channel feels worthwhile. Your support is the strength that helps me overcome challenges, push through exhausting days, and move past moments of self-doubt. I firmly believe that with your companionship, my channel will grow into a space not just for entertainment, but for sharing, learning, and spreading positivity. I look forward to continuing to receive your love, feedback, and support in the time ahead. Once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you to each and every one of you who has made this journey so meaningful. Let's keep walking this path together, creating something even more amazing. I promise to keep working tirelessly to deliver content that's creative, high quality, and worthy of your trust and affection. With heartfelt thanks.